hindrances. There's special techniques for working with what are considered the 5 big enemies of practice. And once you get to that broad middle stage of practice that I talked about, these enemies become far, far less potent, but they need to be talked about and discussed. There's a list of 5 of these big enemies that are given: greed, aversion, sloth or torpor, anxiety or restlessness, and doubt. I'm going to say just a few words about working with each of them. Greed can be very, very subtle. Greed inspires us to try to make certain things happen in our practice that we want to have happen, inspires us to try to do things that allow us to hold on to particular experiences when we like very much what's happening and don't want to let go of it. Greed figures in across the course of the day, too. Maybe such things as walking just a little bit faster to beat the rest of the crowd to the lunch line, or to get into that shower before somebody else does, or spending a lot of time hankering for what I don't have right now. I don't know if I ought to do this. I think I will. Daniel tells a wonderful story about one time when he was sitting out at IMS and the craving for chocolate got so intense that he went in and he asked the office to order him a box of chocolate bars. They've quit doing that for people now. At that time they would, and he went out to the woods behind the center with his box of chocolate bars. But you may have noticed that if there's a particular food that you enjoy eating that hasn't turned up on the menu here, that the hankering of, oh, if I could only have. Needless to say, on a 3-month retreat, when everybody there is prohibited from any form of sexual activity, when day after day after day you eat the food that's given you without having any control or choice over it, just very, very simple little things can take on monumental proportions. But it's helpful to watch our minds, not only during the practice, but in the in-between times, to see when greed is at work, to be aware when that mind state is there. It's a very, very potent puller away from the practice when it really gets going. There's a very special form of greed. Surfaces on longer retreats. It's also possible to surface on shorter ones, that they call the Vipassana romance, which is when there's somebody else present at the place. You don't even know this person. You don't know anything about this person, but something about this person is appealing to you, and you can start building all sorts of fantasy relationships with that person, and you're drawn to try to be where you know that person walks, or to look at that person frequently because it's satisfying to look at the person. It's just an amazing number of things can get going. In the actual practice itself, when we find that greed is making us try to hold on to an experience after it's leaving, or trying to do things to recreate a particular experience, like, gee, the last sitting I had, I was more comfortable than I've been the whole week so far. Now, exactly how was it that I held my body, and what did I do? Can I make that kind of a sitting come back? Most people get into playing a variety of these kinds of games. And the sinking mind that I referred to is another potent form of greed. It feels very good when we can get into that sort of spaced out concentration without sharp awareness and just sort of float there. It can feel very, very blissful. That can be a tremendous pull. And when we realize that it's happening, instead of noting it and trying to sharpen our awareness by picking up the noting or doing whatever is necessary to get ourselves more focused, to just sink out into sinking mind is another potent form of greed. The second big hindrance is aversion. Aversion can get very complicated. We all shared the experience of aversion that somebody mentioned and that a number of us experienced with the car that was trying to start for a couple of mornings in a row. Some mannerism or sound that a person who sits near you makes that's repetitive. Somebody who has a habit of doing something that attracts your attention either in the hall or elsewhere or while they're eating. Little tiny things get so magnified, and we find ourselves tremendously overreacting to the smallest little things. It's because we're getting so hypersensitive to what's going on in us. The little handout that I gave you before the retreat, those of you who read that young woman's experience, her experience of being annoyed when somebody else came and started doing walking meditation near her, very common to be triggered by even very little things like that. It's amazing. We also can get going what we call a Vipassana vendetta. Somebody who's present on the scene, who every time you see that person, it's like fingernails across a chalkboard. There's just something about that person that is so annoying. And then you find your mind saying things like, oh, what's a person like that doing here anyway? And you just wish they'd disappear or go away. All of these things, they can be instructive to us if we simply can watch our minds rather than get lost and caught up in it and be aware when we're colored by aversion. Now, in the actual sitting or walking itself, aversion, of course, is what makes us want to run away from our experiences. I'm getting anxious. I don't like feeling anxious. I think I'll just pull back a little bit from the intensity. Or, gee, I can't stand this pain in my knee for one more minute. All of the, whether we want to run away from the experience, which is most often the case when there's fear or anxiety, whether we want to strike out at and remove the experience, which is anger, whether we get into self-pity or melodramas or poor me kind of stuff because I bet nobody else is having it as hard as I am, and the melodramatic stories that we can find ourselves creating in our minds in which we, of course, are the center suffering hero or heroine, all these kinds of things that are aversion to our experience. If one lets one's practice be ruled by aversion, then you won't ever get anywhere. If because every time you don't like what's happening, you run away from it in some way, clearly you're not letting the practice do what it needs to do for you. Handling greed and aversion, the awareness when it's there, of course, is the very beginning. To be attuned to recognize the many faces that greed and aversion can wear. With regard to greed, they say that the best thing to do is to make an extremely greater effort at concentrated mindfulness. Don't let yourself wander off into that daydream or that fantasy about this other appealing person or the experience of yearning for beets or whatever it is you're not getting that you want. To simply persist in bringing your mind away from the object that you want to dwell on back to mindful awareness of what's happening here, now, in this moment. It's helpful when we're experiencing aversion sometimes to take a couple of minutes for protection of the practice and remind yourself of why you're here, and that can be motivating, and it's worth sometimes taking that couple of minutes to protect your practice. And sometimes pep talks of realizing that you aren't going to die no matter what. I mean, you'll live through it. It might be extremely unpleasant, but you'll live through it. These two, though, if they're allowed to run rampant, you can find that you spend an awful lot of time just being moved around by greed or aversion. The third of these hindrances is called sloth and torpor. This covers things like boredom, sleepiness, and sometimes even resistance to doing the practice. That often has a lot of aversion in it also. We've already talked about some of the ways to manage sleepiness. Chief ones that people use are letting some light into the system, pulling hard on the earlobes until they get warm, staring at light for a while. You also can try things like washing your face with cold water before a sitting. And finally, if all else fails, standing up to do the sitting. Boredom is a function of lax attention. The cure for boredom is to bring your awareness closer into the object that you're watching. There's a story told of one person who found the practice very boring, and the teacher said, well, I think I can help you with that. Come. Took the student out to a pond. All of a sudden, grabbed the student by the neck and pushed the student's head under the water and held it there for quite a while, and the student was twisting and turning and trying to get away. Finally let the student's head up and said, "Do you find the breath very boring now?" When something compellingly grabs our attention, it's no longer boring. We can choose to go into an object with finer-grained, closer attention, and the boredom will vanish. This is true in life also, by the way. People who spend a lot of time being bored, if they would just find something they would invest some attention into, they'd find it does wonders for their boredom. Restlessness and anxiety. Restlessness of the body, anxiety of the mind. They're essentially the same thing. There's an inability to settle, to come, to get gathered together. Mind all over the place, or the body wanting to be all over the place. Sometimes doing more fast walking helps. If there's energy buildup that can be dissipated by doing a longer period of the fast walking, you might try that. If you've had a sitting that has been very restless, the body just does not want to stay settled at all, try making a lot of the next walking period a little bit faster and see if that'll dissipate some of that excess of tension that's built up. There are also times, though, where one has to sort of push oneself up against the edge. And if you realize that you've been doing a lot of moving in the sitting and that you're very restless, it's possible just to say, okay, I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to move for the rest of this sitting. And you might sweat, you might shake. I'm not going to deny those things might not happen, but there's a way to cut through it quickly by doing that sometimes. And I've actually had that experience myself when there's been a lot of restlessness. If you're willing, as I say, you have to be gentle with yourself. There has to be the willingness, but if you're willing to try it, you can often blitz through restlessness that way. Enough is enough. I'm just not going to do it anymore. I'm not going to move anymore, period. It works if you're willing. The restlessness of the mind, if it's either lots of just flitting around or if it's anxious restlessness, one thing that you can do is for a few minutes try opening your awareness up to be aware of as much of the sound around you as you can. Small sounds, distant sounds, the sound of the stillness even if the room is pretty still. There's a spaciousness in sound that gives the restless mind a larger arena to be in for a few minutes. And quite often, if it's not asked to be confined too closely for a short period of time and given that larger arena, it'll be more willing then to settle back down and get focused. And sound is a very good larger arena to give it. It's something you can still stay very aware of and mindful of and concentrated on, but that has that sense of spaciousness, so you're not trying to cram it into a small box over its enormous resistance. You can tame it a little bit by giving it that spaciousness. When there's restlessness of either body or mind, sometimes making certain that you do the walking practice outdoors is helpful. There's just something about being in that larger spaciousness that outdoors is that can also have a calming effect on the restlessness of body or mind. So those are a few tools you can use to work with that. Finally, there's doubt. Doubt takes a number of forms. Doubt is one thing that we use because it's about the very best excuse that we can find when we have a lot of resistance to the practice and we want a very face-saving way to not do it. You can always start doubting. Well, I'm not so sure this practice can do anything anyway, or I'm not so sure the teachers know what they're doing, or I don't think this is the right time for me to try to do this, or maybe I'm not capable of doing this. I mean, it can be doubt about self, about practice, about the time, the circumstances, anything you can find to doubt. When there's a real resistance to doing the practice entering in that you don't want to recognize just as a resistance to doing the practice, doubt is one of the main things that the mind can start throwing up that gives a very, very face-saving way out. Then it's not that I didn't want to do the practice, it's that this was wrong or that was wrong or this other thing was wrong. To recognize that our minds have a tendency to do that is very helpful. One way to counteract that, and this can go with whatever spiritual practice you're doing, not just this one, whatever spiritual practice you're doing. And if you go back to doing another one when you leave here, you can apply it to that spiritual practice. Or if you're doing this one, apply it to this one. For this week, one can simply make the resolution, if I wind up 10 years from now deciding that it was the most wasted week of my life, still, I came. I paid my money. I went to all the trouble of traveling there. I'm going to at least make the commitment for this week to give my all to it just to see. If I don't do that when this week is over, I'll never know. If I don't, and if I do wind up deciding it was the biggest waste of time in the world, at least if I have made the commitment to give my all to it for the time I'm there, I know that at least. And I know that it's not that I shilly-shallied around and let this or that or the other doubt keep me from applying myself to something that I decided I was going to do. I will add that for people who think this practice has something for them, and I'm pleased, of course, that a number of you have said that that is so, if you're willing to make a commitment of 6 months, that you'll work at it daily, I absolutely guarantee you that by the end of that 6 months, you will know that this practice can do a lot for you. It probably will not take 6 months. There'll be many of you who will leave here this week knowing that this practice can do a lot for you. But 6 months, the absolute maximum outside that it would take to know that this practice can do something for you. So if you're attracted to it, I recommend that you give it a chance. Then at the end of 6 months, you can decide. However, if you have another practice that you're going to go back to, the same kind of commitment can apply to that you can set a period of time. I've decided I'm going to do this practice. I will do it. If it ceases to be a matter of whether I feel like doing it today or not, which never works for maintaining any kind of spiritual practice, each day I wake up and decide whether I feel like I'm going to do it today, doesn't work. A time-limited commitment at which one makes the promise to oneself, regardless of whether it feels like a good idea or not, all the doubts that might come up, is really the only way to go, regardless of whatever practice or any practice that one wants to do. So doubt applies in other places than just Vipassana. It can derail any spiritual practice very easily. So for this week, though, I suggest that you deal with doubt by making the commitment to doing what you came to do, so that you'll know at the end of the week that at least you tried it, and you know what it was like for you. We have a very short sitting time. So, please get your sitting posture. Bones stacked up on top of each other. Shoulders over hip bones. Head not hanging forward. Attention on the breath at the place where you watch it, inside the sensations, with your noting. Experiences of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, body sensations, mind states, where you find your attention drawn, rest in that experience, noting it, repeating the note every 5 to 10 seconds, as long as the experience lasts and you're still watching it. When the experience ends, return to the breath. Be very quick to catch thinking and note it, and see the thinking die. Go back to the breath. Okay.